The last member of the Ptolemaic dynasty was not killed in Egypt. He was not killed over a throne. He was killed in Rome in the year 40 AD because he wore a purple cloak to the games and the emperor did not care for it. Caligula had him dragged away and executed on the spot. His name was Ptolemy of Mauritania, Cleopatra's grandson, and nobody talks about him. Everyone knows the Ptolemies through Cleopatra, the Asp, the love triangle with Caesar and Antony. Fine. But the dynasty behind her ran for 365 years, and what happened inside that bloodline across those centuries makes the Habsburgs look like amateurs. The Habsburgs married cousins and uncles and nieces over a few dozen generations. The Ptolemies married their own full-blooded brothers and sisters, generation after generation after generation for a quarter of a millennium. 10 or 11 of their 15 royal marriages were between full siblings, not half-siblings, not cousins. Full brother to full sister, children of the same mother and father, and they did it knowing their own Greek culture considered it an abomination. So, how did a Macedonian Greek military family end up running the longest-lasting incest dynasty in the ancient world? And how did they convince everyone it was holy? It starts with a funeral heist. In 321 BC, Ptolemy, son of Lagos, one of Alexander the Great's generals, hijacked Alexander's funeral cortege as it rolled through Syria. The gold-encased body was supposed to go to Macedonia. Ptolemy diverted it to Egypt. He installed himself as governor, then pharaoh, and built his capital at Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast. A Greek-speaking military elite now governed a country where 90% of the population spoke Egyptian. For the next 270 years, not a single Ptolemaic ruler would bother to learn the language. That gap matters. The first generation was conventional. Ptolemy I married Berenice I, a distant cousin. Normal Macedonian aristocratic behaviour. His son Ptolemy II is where things go sideways. Around 273 BC, Ptolemy II Philadelphus married his full sister Arsinoe II. To make room, he banished his first wife, another woman also named Arsinoe, to Coptos in Upper Egypt on a trumped-up conspiracy charge. The marriage to his sister produced no children. Arsinoe II simply adopted his existing kids. But the marriage itself was the point. Not procreation. Something else entirely. The standard explanation you will find everywhere is that the Ptolemies adopted sibling marriage from the pharaohs they replaced. This is the comfortable version. This is also largely wrong. 3 problems with it. First, pharaonic full sibling marriage was rare and scattered across 3,000 years of Egyptian history. Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings, confirmed by DNA. Hatshepsut and Thutmose II is debated. Most other royal Egyptian marriages were half-sibling or step-sibling at most. Second, there is a 250-year gap between the last credible New Kingdom royal sibling marriage, around 1300 BC, and Ptolemy II marrying Arsinoe II in 273 BC. The Sate pharaohs did not do it. The Nubian pharaohs did not do it. The Persian overlords did not do it. The tradition was dead for a quarter of a millennium before the Ptolemies picked it up. Third, ordinary Egyptians were not marrying their siblings either. Keith Hopkins published a landmark study in 1980, finding that 15 to 24% of marriages in certain Roman period Fayum census returns were between brothers and sisters. But all the data comes from the Roman period, after 250 years of Ptolemaic rule. The commoner sibling marriage phenomenon looks more like a downstream effect of the Ptolemaic example than a continuous native custom. Hopkins was challenged by Sabine Hübner, who suggested adoption marriages might explain some cases, and defended by Remison and Clarisse on papyrological grounds. The consensus tilts back toward Hopkins. So if the Ptolemies were not copying an existing tradition, what were they doing? And why are they the famous case when other dynasties practiced close-kin marriage too? The Hawaiian Alipio theologized full sibling marriage across many generations. The Inkasap Inca married his full sister as Koya for pure succession over 3 or 4 generations. The Achaemenid Persians supposedly did it, though J.M. Bigwood argued in 2009 that Herodotus's claim about Cambyses is hostile propaganda, and the actual evidence for full sibling marriage among the Persians is weak. The Ptolemies stand out because they were Greek-speaking elites living in the most densely documented period of antiquity, because Octavian's anti-Cleopatra propaganda preserved their scandal in the Roman literary tradition for centuries, and because they did it knowing their own contemporaries considered it monstrous. The Hawaiians and Inca operated within cultures where close-kin royal marriage was sacred and normal. The Ptolemies operated within a culture where it was shameful, and they did it anyway. The most important modern reframe comes from Sheila Ager, a classicist who published in the Journal of Hellenic Studies in 2005 and expanded the argument in Anthropologica in 2006. Her thesis is blunt. The Ptolemies were not hiding the incest behind religious cover, they were flaunting it. The transgression itself was the message. Sibling marriage was part of a broader pattern of what the Greeks called tryphy, extravagant excess meant to signal superhuman status. The Ptolemaic court featured spectacular feasting, competitive drinking, and a grand procession described by Calixenus of Rhodes, preserved through Athenaeus, that included gold beyond counting, and a 180-foot phallus carried on a cart through the streets of Alexandria. There was a mechanical statue of Nysa that stood up by itself and poured milk. They built a warship called the Tesseraconteres, 420 feet long, with a beam of 38 cubits, requiring 4,000 rowers, 400 supernumeraries, and close to 3,000 marines. Plutarch admitted it was meant for exhibition, and not for use, and could only be moved with difficulty and danger. Lionel Casson proposed it was actually a catamaran made of 2 trireme hulls lashed together. No ancient displacement figure exists for the ship, so any tonnage number you see in pop history is a modern guess. They also built the Thalamigos, a Nile floating palace half a stadion long, roughly 300 feet, with 2 stories of dining halls, a peristyle court, a temple of Aphrodite with a marble statue, and fittings of cedar and cypress. These were not accidents of wealth, they were policy. Sibling marriage was the apex of that excess. It said, "We are not bound by your rules because we are not, properly speaking, human." And the Greeks in Alexandria absolutely understood how transgressive this was. Sibling marriage was aiskron in Athenian law. Shameful. The Alexandrian court poet Theocritus was pressed into service to defend the union, and what he produced was a direct analogy to Zeus and Hera in Idyll 17. One bed that Iris prepares for the king and queen of Olympus. If Zeus can marry his sister, so can Ptolemy. Meanwhile, in the Egyptian language texts, Arsinoe II was systematically rewritten as Isis, who married her brother Osiris. The couple received the cult title Theoi Philadelphoi, sibling-loving gods. The scandal was not suppressed but rebranded as divinity. Susan Stevens at UC Berkeley argued that the Alexandrian poets wrote deliberately double-coded verse, Greek mythology from one angle, Egyptian theology from the other, both pointing at the same royal marriage. Not everyone bought the sales pitch. A poet named Sotades of Maronea wrote a single line about the marriage that still survives. "Into an unholy hole you thrust your goad." The original Greek is blunter than the translation. Sotades fled Alexandria. He was caught at Carnus in Caria by Patroclus, the admiral of Ptolemy II's fleet. They sealed him in a lead jar and threw him in the sea. Daniel Ogden, writing in 1999, offered a complimentary political reading. Sibling marriage eliminated the threat of outside in-law factions. No Seleucid agents whispering in the queen's ear. No Antigonid cousins angling for the throne. It neutralised rival siblings by marrying them into the power structure rather than exiling or killing them. It avoided what Ogden called amphimetric strife, the brutal half-sibling succession wars that destroyed both the Antigonid and Seleucid dynasties, and it kept the Theon Genos, the divine race, undiluted. Whether it actually worked is another question. The dynasty lasted 280 years, longer than any other Hellenistic royal house, which counts for something. But it also produced the Ptolemy VIII civil war, the brothers' war between Lithyros and Ptolemy X, and the Cleopatra VII versus Ptolemy XIII conflict, probably as many crises caused as prevented. Elizabeth Carney added the female power dimension in 2013. Ptolemaic queens wielded authority unmatched in any other Hellenistic dynasty because a sister wife was structurally indispensable. She was not a foreign import who could be discarded. She had her own legitimacy, her own supporters, her own claim to the divine bloodline. Pharaonic theology demanded a female counterpart, the king's great wife, as an embodiment of Ma'at and Isis, and the sister fit doctrinally. The downside, of course, is that the daughters had no choice in any of it. The system produced monsters, not metaphorical ones. Ptolemy IV came to power around 222 BC and married his full sister Arsinoe III. They produced a son, Ptolemy V. His chief minister Sosibius, with Ptolemy's complicity, poisoned his mother Berenice II and scalded his brother Magus to death in a bath. Popular sources often say he also murdered his father, but that claim is not in Polybius, who is our primary source for this period. Polybius had plenty of contempt for Ptolemy IV without needing to invent a patricide. He painted him as a drunk controlled by his mistress Agathoclea and her brother Agathocles. The problem with that portrait is that Ptolemy IV also won the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC, defeating the Seleucid king Antiochus III with a force of 20,000 native Egyptian infantry he had armed and trained for the occasion, which is not something useless drunks typically manage. When Ptolemy IV died, Agathocles and Agathoclea tried to control the child king Ptolemy V. The Alexandrian mob settled that question. Polybius describes the scene in detail. The crowd tore them both apart in the streets. That was tame compared to what came next. Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physgon, which means potbelly. The Alexandrians had a different name for him. Kakagates, the malefactor, a pun on his official title Euergetes the benefactor. He married his sister Cleopatra II. Then, without divorcing her, he also married her daughter, his own niece and stepdaughter, Cleopatra III. Simultaneously, a mother and her daughter married to the same man, who was the mother's brother. Civil war between the factions broke out around 132 BC, and what Physgon did next remains the single worst act in the entire dynasty. He summoned his 12-year-old son Ptolemy Memphites, his child by Cleopatra II, to Cyprus. He killed the boy and dismembered him. Justin tells us the head, hands and feet were boxed up and shipped to Alexandria, time to arrive on Cleopatra II's birthday. She reportedly took the box and displayed it to the crowd to rally them against her brother-husband. Christopher Bennett, the definitive modern genealogist for the Ptolemies, notes that the birthday gift framing might be Justin's rhetorical embellishment. He uses the device elsewhere. But the murder and the dismemberment are corroborated by Diodorus. The boy is dead either way. Physgon was also grotesquely obese. Posidonius, writing through the historian Athenaeus, describes a belly so large no one could put their arms all the way around it. Justin adds the detail of transparent gauze garments through which his blown-out body showed. When Scipio Aemilianus visited Alexandria on a Roman embassy around 140 BC, he supposedly said afterward that the Alexandrians owed him one thing. They had seen their king walk. The contempt is not subtle, but Physgon was also a writer. He produced 24 books of memoirs, the Hypomnemata, a miscellany of court anecdotes, exotic animals, banquet stories, and observations from foreign lands. Fragments survive in Athenaeus. The man who dismembered his own son and mailed the parts to the boy's mother spent his free time collecting curiosities, a paradoxographer. Historians have not figured out how to reconcile the two selves, and honestly there may not be a reconciliation to find. He was both things at once. He also gutted the intellectual life of Alexandria. His purge expelled everyone who mattered: grammarians, philosophers, geometers, musicians, painters, physicians. The named casualties are painful in hindsight. Aristarchus of Samothrace, the head of the library and the greatest Homeric textual critic of antiquity, was driven out. So was Apollodorus of Athens, the chronographer whose work forms the backbone of most ancient chronology that survives today. Menocles of Barca recorded the Purge, preserved through Athenaeus. That diaspora scattered the best minds in the Mediterranean to Rhodes, Athens and Pergamon, reviving Greek scholarship across the Aegean, one of the most consequential brain drains in the ancient world, inflicted by a king on his own capital because he was paranoid about internal opposition. The brothers who came after Physgon continued the pattern. Ptolemy IX, nicknamed Lathros, which means chickpea, probably after a wart on his face, married two of his full sisters in sequence, Cleopatra IV and then Cleopatra Selene. Their mother, Cleopatra III, preferred the other son, Ptolemy X, and deposed Lathyrus in 107 BC. The brothers fought a civil war for 2 decades. Ptolemy X was obese on a scale that made Physcon look svelte. Posidonius again via Athenaeus. He could not walk without leaning on 2 attendants, but at banquets he would leap off a high couch and dance barefoot. Pop history routinely conflates his anecdote with Physcon's. They are 2 different men from the same source. Physcon's signature is the transparent clothing and the Scipio quip. Ptolemy X's signature is the barefoot dancing. Ptolemy X also killed his own mother, Cleopatra III, in 101 BC, when he realised she planned to kill him first. And then he did something that got him killed. He melted down Alexander the Great's golden sarcophagus. Strabo names him explicitly, calling him the Ptolemy nicknamed Kokes and Parizaktos, the smuggled in. He stripped the gold coffin to pay his mercenaries. Alexander's body was reinterred in a glass or rock crystal coffin, where it remained for the rest of antiquity. The Alexandrians drove Ptolemy X out in 88 BC. He fled to Cyprus, raised a fleet by mortgaging Egypt's sovereignty to Rome, through a controversial will that Cicero would later cite in De Lege Agraria to argue for Roman annexation, and died at sea. Lithyros came back. His revenge was total. The great Egyptian city of Thebes, already diminished but still the spiritual heartland of Upper Egypt, had revolted. The revolt lasted 3 years. Lithyros crushed it by destroying the city. Pausanias and Strabo both record the devastation. Thebes never recovered. The city that had been the capital of New Kingdom Egypt was functionally dead, flattened by a Ptolemaic king settling a score after a civil war against his own brother. Then came Ptolemy XI, who holds the record for the shortest meaningful reign in the dynasty, 19 days. Sulla installed him in Alexandria in 80 BC as a Roman puppet. The city did not want him. They wanted Berenice III, his much older stepmother and cousin, who had been ruling capably on her own for 6 months and was beloved by the population. The Alexandrians expected the marriage would be a partnership. Ptolemy XI had her murdered within 19 days. Porphyry preserves the day count. Whatever he thought would happen next, what actually happened is that the Alexandrian mob dragged him from the palace to the gymnasium and tore him apart there. Appian confirms it. Alexandria had a long and specific tradition of killing Ptolemies it did not like, and Ptolemy XI seems not to have studied the pattern. Cleopatra's father was Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Auletes, the flute player. He was probably the illegitimate son of Ptolemy IX by a concubine. Pausanias says Ptolemy IX had no legitimate sons, and Justin calls Auletes Nothos bastard. Some scholars argue the concubine may have been of Egyptian or part Egyptian origin, which is the actual basis for any serious claim that Cleopatra had some Egyptian ancestry. Strabo records that Auletes competed in musical contests in his own palace, playing the aulos in Dionysiac festivals, performing in person, which was considered beneath a king by Greek aristocratic standards. Strabo's judgment on the later Ptolemies as a whole is worth noting. All of the kings after the third Ptolemy, being corrupted by luxurious living, administered the affairs of government badly, but worst of all were the 4th, 7th, and the last, Auletes. When he was driven into exile in 58 BC, he travelled to Rome and borrowed catastrophically from a Roman financier named Gaius Rabirius Postumus, backed by Pompey, to fund his restoration by force. The proconsul Aulus Gabinius marched in and reinstated him in 55 BC for a bribe of 10,000 talents. A young Mark Antony rode in the restoration cavalry. That is how Antony first set foot in Egypt, years before he ever met Cleopatra. Rabirius Postumus was installed as Egypt's Dioeketes, its finance minister, to extract repayment. The Alexandrians drove him out. Back in Rome, he was prosecuted, and Cicero defended him in the speech Pro Rabiria Postumo in 54 BC. This was how deeply Rome was already entangled in Ptolemaic affairs. Roman businessmen lending at catastrophic interest to exiled pharaohs, Roman generals selling military restorations for the equivalent of a kingdom's annual revenue, Roman lawyers defending the whole arrangement in court. During the exile, Auletes' daughter Berenice IV ruled in his place. The Alexandrians arranged a husband for her, a man named Seleucus who claimed Seleucid royal ancestry. His nickname was Kybiosactes, salt fish monger. Kybion was the cured belly meat of large fish, the stuff sold in markets by the slab. Whether the nickname described his manners or his actual previous occupation depends on which source you trust. Strabo records that Berenice had him strangled within days because she could not bear his coarseness and vulgarity. Cassius Dio corroborates the strangling. She married a second husband, Archelaus, who claimed descent from Mithridates VI. He was killed fighting the Romans who restored her father. Auletes executed his own daughter, Berenice, immediately on his return. The genetic consequences of 10 generations of close kin marriage are visible in the physical record, though they have to be read carefully. Hutana Shrafian published a paper in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine in 2005 examining the iconographic evidence across the dynasty. Coins and statuary from Ptolemy II onward show recurring bulging eyes and thick necks. Older scholarship attributed this to familial Graves's disease, but Ashrafian rejected that diagnosis because untreated Graves's produces weight loss, not the morbid obesity documented in multiple Ptolemies. His proposed alternatives included Erdheim-Chester disease and familial multifocal fibrous sclerosis, both autosomal conditions consistent with consanguinity. Other researchers pointed toward a Pickwickian syndrome phenotype, sleep apnea tied to extreme obesity. The obesity cases are well sourced in the ancient record. Physcon's belly and transparent clothes, Ptolemy X's inability to walk unaided. The infertility pattern is suggestive too. Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II were childless. Cleopatra VII's marriages to both Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV produced no children, and Ptolemy XI's marriage to Berenice III lasted all of 19 days. Each case has alternative explanations. Ptolemy XIII was about 10 years old. Ptolemy XI did not live long enough. But the broader pattern across the dynasty points toward inbreeding depression reducing fecundity over time. Now the number you will find everywhere online. Cleopatra had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.45, higher than the Habsburgs. This is not peer-reviewed science. It traces to a University of Washington biostatistics teaching exercise, an undergraduate homework problem, not a published paper. No academic has computed Cleopatra's inbreeding coefficient with confidence because her mother's identity is genuinely unknown. Cleopatra V. Tryphena is the leading candidate. Michael Grant argued that if Cleopatra VII were illegitimate, her many Roman enemies would have used it. Dwayne Roller speculated her mother might have been a half-Macedonian, half-Egyptian woman from the high priestly family of Ptah at Memphis. The question is unresolved. The only properly peer-reviewed royal inbreeding calculation is Alvarez, Ceballos, and Quintero's 2009 +1 paper, which gave Habsburg Charles II an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254. Cleopatra's was plausibly higher, given 4 to 6 consecutive close-kin generations in her direct ancestry, but nobody can put a precise number on it. Which brings us to Cleopatra VII herself, and to all the things most people get wrong about her. She was not described as a peerless beauty. That is a Hollywood invention. Plutarch, our best narrative source, wrote that her beauty was not altogether incomparable, nor such as to strike those who saw her. What made her irresistible was conversation, voice, and presence. The coins struck under her own authority, the most reliable physical evidence we have, show an aquiline nose, a sharp chin, a prominent brow, hair in a melon coiffure with a diadem. The clearest are the tetradrachms from Antioch, struck around 36 BC. The Berlin Cleopatra, a marble head in the Alta Museum dating to around 40 to 30 BC, is the best surviving sculpted portrait and corroborates the sharp profile. The Vatican Cleopatra, found on the Via Appia in 1784, is damaged but tells the same story. Hollywood Cleopatra is fiction. The historical Cleopatra was a sharp-featured Macedonian Greek woman with a strong nose who conquered rooms by talking, not by walking in. She spoke at least 9 languages. Plutarch lists Ethiopian, Troglodyte, Hebrew, Arabian, Syrian, Median, Parthian, plus Greek and Egyptian. She was the first Ptolemy in over 270 years to learn Egyptian. Plutarch notes that earlier kings had not even made an effort, and some actually gave up their Macedonian dialect. Rolf Strootman at Utrecht has reframed her language list as a map of imperial pretensions. Each language corresponds to a territorial claim or ambition: Ethiopian and Troglodyte for Red Sea trade, Median and Parthian for Antony's Eastern campaign. Her multilingualism was performed political theatre as much as personal accomplishment. She was also not an alchemist, despite what the internet will tell you. Texts on cosmetics, gynecology, alchemy and weights, attributed to a Cleopatra, are medieval conflations of three different women who shared the name. Cleopatra the physician was a Greek medical writer of the late 1st century AD, cited by Galen. Cleopatra the alchemist was a 3rd or 4th century Alexandrian who wrote the Chrysopoeia, a symbolic diagram from which the Ouroboros symbol is attributed to her. Neither was the queen. What Cleopatra VII actually did with her political capital was stage-manage empire on a scale Rome found threatening. In autumn of 34 BC, in the Gymnasium of Alexandria, Antony sat on a golden throne dressed as Dionysus and Osiris, while Cleopatra sat beside him as Isis and Aphrodite, the new Isis. Their children, dressed in the costumes of their assigned realms, received territorial grants. 6-year-old Alexander Helios got Armenia, Media and Parthia. His twin Cleopatra Selene got Cyrenaica and Libya. 2-year-old Ptolemy Philadelphus got Syria, Phoenicia and Cilicia. Caesarion was proclaimed King of Kings, and publicly affirmed as Julius Caesar's son. That last claim was the one that mattered. It directly threatened Octavian's legitimacy as Caesar's adopted heir. Octavian seized Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins, read it to the Senate, emphasized the donations and Antony's request to be buried in Alexandria, and declared war on Cleopatra. Not on Antony, on her. Actium followed in 31 BC. Her death was almost certainly not an aespe. Strabo, who was in Alexandria at or shortly after the event, wrote that 2 accounts are given and did not pick one. Egyptian cobra venom kills with vomiting, paralysis, and disfiguring necrosis over 30 minutes or more. That does not match the clean, quiet death described by our sources. Christoph Schaefer, at the University of Trier, working with the toxicologist Dietrich Mebs at Frankfurt, argued in 2010 for a hemlock, aconite and opium cocktail. Galen, centuries earlier, had already proposed she bit her own arm and introduced poison through a hollow scratching pin. Plutarch himself notes she had tested poisons on condemned prisoners. She knew what worked. Where she was buried is another open question. Mainstream Egyptology places her in a mausoleum within Alexandria's royal quarter, now submerged in the eastern harbour. But since 2005, Kathleen Martinez, a Dominican lawyer turned archaeologist, has been excavating Taposiris Magna, a Ptolemaic temple to Osiris about 45 kilometres west of Alexandria. Her team has found Cleopatra-era coins, foundation deposits with Isis iconography, and 27 tombs in the surrounding necropolis, including gilded mummies. In November 2022, they discovered a rock-cut tunnel over 1,300 metres long, 2 metres tall, 13 metres underground, portions of it submerged heading seaward. In September 2025, a joint expedition with Robert Ballard located a submerged ancient port off the Taposiris coast. Martinez's hypothesis is that Cleopatra's body was moved through the tunnel to the offshore site. It is unproven. Zahi Hawass still favours the Alexandria location. The search is ongoing. There is one more myth to address, though it is more recent. In 2009, a BBC documentary claimed that a skeleton excavated from a tomb called the Octagon in Ephesus belonged to Arsinoe IV, Cleopatra's younger sister, and that the skeleton's features proved partial African ancestry for the Ptolemaic line. This went viral. It is still repeated. In January 2025, Gerhard Weber's team at the University of Vienna published in Scientific Reports the results of micro-CT imaging, mass spectrometry, and ancient DNA sequencing on those same bones. They found a Y chromosome. The skeleton is male. The individual was an 11 to 14-year-old boy of Central Italian or Sardinian ancestry. Anyone still citing the BBC documentary as recycling falsified science. Arsinoe IV's actual story is grim enough without the fabricated skeleton. Captured during the Alexandrian War, she was paraded in chains during Caesar's quadruple triumph in 46 BC. Cassius Dio records something unusual. The Roman crowd was moved to pity by the sight of her. Caesar broke with custom and spared her, which is worth comparing to Vercingetorix, who was strangled the same day from a different leg of the same triumph. Arsinoe was sent to the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus as an asylum suppliant, where she acquired a kind of quasi-priestess status. In 41 BC, on Cleopatra's request, Antony ordered her killed at the temple. The Greco-Roman world remembered that sacrilege for centuries, and Octavian's propaganda machine made sure they did. After Cleopatra and Antony died in 30 BC, Octavian had Caesarion killed. The philosopher Arios Didymos of Alexandria sealed the boy's fate with a pun on Homer. The original line from the Iliad, "The rule of many is not good." Arios's version, "A multitude of Caesars is not good." Caesarion was 16 or 17. He died in late August of 30 BC. But the Ptolemaic bloodline did not die with him. Cleopatra's 3 children by Antony were paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph of 29 BC in golden chains, alongside a stuffed effigy of their dead mother. Then, something unexpected happened. They were handed over to Octavia Minor, Antony's Roman ex-wife and Octavian's sister. By all accounts, Octavia raised them well. The 2 sons, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, disappear from the record and likely died young of disease or neglect. No execution is recorded. The daughter survived. Cleopatra Selene II, named for the moon, born in 40 BC, twin of Alexander Helios. She had been declared Queen of Cyrenaica at the donations of Alexandria when she was 6 years old, sitting on a golden throne while her mother dressed as Isis and her father dressed as Dionysus. By the age of 11, she was an orphan paraded through the streets of a foreign city. In 25 BC, Augustus arranged her marriage to Juba II of Numidia, another orphan prince raised in Rome whose own father had killed himself after losing to Caesar. They were installed as client monarchs of Mauritania, modern Morocco and Algeria, with their capital at Aeol Caesarea, modern Churchill. Cleopatra Selene brought Alexandrian scholars and artists to the court, minted coins under her own name in Greek with the legend Basilissa Cleopatra, revived Isis worship in the Western Mediterranean, and named her son Ptolemy. Duane Roller, who wrote the definitive scholarly treatment of her life, emphasised that Cleopatra Selene actively maintained Ptolemaic court culture, an Isis cult in Mauritania. Cleopatra VII's cultural legacy survived 4 decades longer than her political one, in North Africa, in Greek, with Egyptian gods, run by a woman who'd been paraded through Rome in golden chains at the age of 10. Selene died around 5 BC, age 35. Her tomb, the Royal Mausoleum of Mauritania, still stands outside Tipasa, Algeria. Her son Ptolemy of Mauritania co-ruled with his father and became sole king in 23 AD. For 17 years he governed a client kingdom in North Africa, carrying the name of a dynasty that most people assume ended with an asp bite 3 generations earlier. Then Caligula summoned him to Rome, and the purple cloak was the last thing he wore. Mauritania was annexed as 2 Roman provinces. With that, the bloodline of Ptolemy I Soter, alive for 365 years, from Alexander's hijacked funeral cortege to a murdered client king in Rome, was finished. The Ptolemies ran the longest-lasting incest dynasty in the documented ancient world. They did it not by accident or cultural inheritance, but as a deliberate program of transgressive self-deification. They manufactured their own divinity out of the one act their own culture considered most shameful, and they sustained it for a quarter of a millennium, across civil wars, matricides, a dismembered child delivered as a birthday gift, the destruction of Thebes, the gutting of the library's scholars, and the slow physical deterioration of their own bodies. The Habsburgs played the same game 1,700 years later, with cousins and nieces. The Ptolemies did it with brothers and sisters from the start on purpose, and dared anyone to say a word about it. The last man who did ended up sealed in a lead jar at the bottom of the sea.